Hey there, friends. Get ready, because I've got a super fun story for you today. It's all about a guy named Jake and a sneaky neighbor named Karen. This story starts on a bright, sunny afternoon in a little town called Pinewood. Pinewood was a happy place with small houses, green yards, and friendly people. Kids played outside, dogs barked, and everyone knew each other. It was the kind of town where nothing big usually happened until Karen decided to stir things up. Let me tell you about Jake Carter first. Jake was a regular guy, just like someone you might know. He wasn't super tall or super loud. He was friendly, smiled a lot, and worked hard every day. Jake had a little house with a big backyard that he loved. That backyard was his favorite spot. He'd sit there with a cold drink, listen to the birds, and just relax after a long day. He wasn't the kind of person who yelled or made a fuss. Nope, Jake liked things calm and quiet. He was happy with his simple life, and he didn't bother anyone. But then there was Karen Miller. Oh boy, Karen was different. She lived right across the street from Jake in a house with a bright red door. Everyone in Pinewood knew Karen, and not always in a good way. She was the lady who had something to say about everything. If your grass grew a little too tall, Karen would march over and tell you to cut it. If your dog barked even once, she'd complain it was too loud. One time, she told old Mr. Jenkins his car was parked too close to her driveway even though it wasn't. Most people in town just shook their heads and ignored her. That's just Karen, they'd say with a laugh. She was bossy and nosy, but nobody thought she'd cause real trouble. Jake didn't think so either. He'd wave at Karen when he saw her, just to be nice. She'd wave back, but her smile always looked a little fake. Jake didn't know it yet, but Karen was about to do something so sneaky, so wild, that it would flip his quiet life upside down. Can you imagine someone messing with your stuff and acting like it's no big deal? That's exactly what was coming for Jake, and he didn't see it yet. Picture this, it was a warm, sunny day. The sky was blue, and a soft breeze made the trees sway. Jake was in his backyard, sitting on a chair with his feet up. He was happy, sipping some lemonade and watching a squirrel run across the grass. Everything felt perfect. Across the street, Karen was outside too. She was standing in her yard, arms crossed, staring at Jake's house. Her eyes were squinting, like she was thinking hard about something. Jake didn't notice. He was too busy enjoying his day. But Karen? She had a plan, a sneaky, tricky plan, and Jake was about to get caught right in the middle of it. Now, let me ask you something, okay? What would you do if someone tried to take something that's yours? Like, imagine you have a favorite toy or a special spot you love, and someone just walks up and says, "Nope, this is mine now." Would you get mad? Would you tell them to stop? Or would you wait and figure out a smart way to fix it? Think about that for a second, because that's what Jake's about to face. Drop your answer in the comments below, I'd love to hear what you'd do. Oh, and while you're at it, tell me where you're watching from today. Are you at home? At school? Somewhere else? And if you like fun stories like this, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Back to the story. Jake had no clue what Karen was up to. He didn't know that this sunny day was the start of something big. See, Karen wasn't just bossy, she was bold. She didn't care if something belonged to someone else. If she wanted it, she'd try to take it. And that's where Jake's backyard comes in. That big, green space wasn't just Jake's favorite spot, it was something Karen had her eye on too. She didn't like that Jake had such a nice yard while hers was smaller. She didn't say it out loud, but deep down, she was jealous. And when Karen got jealous, she didn't just sit there. She did something about it. Here's how it started. That afternoon, while Jake was relaxing, Karen walked over to her shed. She pulled out a big tape measure, the kind you use to measure stuff like furniture or a room. She stretched it out and started walking toward Jake's yard. She didn't ask him. She didn't say hi. She just marched right up to his grass and started measuring it, muttering to herself. Jake looked up, confused. "Hey, Karen," he called out, "what are you doing?" She didn't even turn around. She just kept measuring, like she owned the place. Jake scratched his head. He didn't get mad, not yet. He figured maybe she was just being weird again. Karen was always doing strange things, right? But then she looked at him with a big, Smug grin. "This part of the yard," she said, pointing at Jake's grass, "it's mine. I checked, and it belongs to me." Jake blinked. What?" he said. He couldn't believe it. His yard? His favorite spot. Karen was saying it was hers? That didn't make any sense. But Karen didn't stop there. She went back to her house, grabbed some wooden boards, and called a couple of workers over. Before Jake knew it, those workers were digging holes and hammering stuff right on his land. They were building something, and Karen was telling them where to put it. Jake stood there, watching, his mouth open. He couldn't believe his eyes. Karen was trying to take his backyard, and she didn't even care that he was right there. That's when Jake realized, this wasn't just Karen being annoying. This was Karen being sneaky and mean. She thought Jake wouldn't fight back. She thought he was too nice, too quiet, to stop her. But here's the thing, she didn't know Jake as well as she thought. Jake wasn't loud, but he wasn't weak either. He had a plan of his own brewing, and Karen was about to find out the hard way. So, what do you think happens next? Will Jake let Karen take his yard? Or will he do something smart to stop her? Stick around, because this story's about to get wild. I'll give you a little hint, Karen's big mistake was thinking Jake wouldn't fight back. She had no idea what was coming. Let's see how it all plays out. Keep watching, friends. Alright, friends, let's jump back into Jake's story. Things are about to get tricky in Pinewood, so get comfy and listen up. One day, Jake was sitting in his little house, looking out the window. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and everything seemed normal. But then, he noticed something weird going on across the street. Karen, yup, that nosy neighbor Karen was outside in her yard, and she wasn't alone. She had a bunch of workers with her. They were carrying shovels, big pieces of wood, and bags of nails. Karen was yelling at them, pointing her finger like she was the boss of everything. At first, Jake didn't think much of it. He leaned back in his chair and said to himself, "Oh, she's probably just building something ugly again." Karen loved making stuff in her yard, stuff nobody liked. One time, she built a giant birdhouse that fell over in the wind. Another time, she put up a weird statue that scared all the cats away. So Jake figured this was just another one of her silly projects. He shrugged and took a sip of his water. No big deal, right? But then, Jake's eyes got wide. He put his glass down and stood up fast. Those workers. They weren't digging in Karen's yard. Nope. They were on his land. Jake rubbed his eyes to make sure he wasn't dreaming. Sure enough, there they were, shovels in the dirt, wood stacked up, right in the middle of his big, beautiful backyard. And what were they building? A giant, ugly fence. It was tall and wobbly, with pointy tops that looked mean. Karen was standing there, arms crossed, telling the workers where to put every piece. Jake's heart started beating fast. That was his yard, the place where he played catch with his dog, where he grew flowers, where he sat to watch the stars at night. And now Karen was acting like it belonged to her. He couldn't believe it. He pulled on his shoes and marched outside, still confused. The workers kept hammering, and Karen kept yelling. Jake walked right up to her and said, Karen, what's going on? That's my property." Karen turned around real slow. She looked at Jake with a big, sassy smirk like she thought she was smarter than him. Her eyes were shiny with mischief, and she tilted her head like she was about to win a game. "No, Jake," she said, her voice sharp and loud. "I measured it myself. This land's mine now. Deal with it." Then she turned back to the workers and waved her hand, like Jake was just a pesky fly she could shoo away. Jake stood there, blinking. Her words hit him like a splash of cold water. Deal with it? What did that even mean? This was his backyard, not hers. He could feel his face getting hot, and his hands balled up into fists. Karen's sassy tone made him so mad he wanted to yell. He wanted to tell her she was wrong. He wanted to rip that fence down with his bare hands. But Jake didn't do that. Nope. He took a deep breath and stayed calm. See, Jake wasn't a fighter. He didn't like shouting or arguing. He was a thinker, a guy who used his brain instead of his voice. Karen didn't know that, though. She looked at him standing there, all quiet, and she thought she'd won. She thought Jake was too nice to stop her. In her mind, he was just a pushover, a guy who'd let her do whatever she wanted. She smirked again and said to the workers, "Keep going, boys. This is my spot now." The hammering got louder, and that ugly fence got taller. Jake watched as it cut right through his yard, splitting his favorite place in half. But here's the thing, Karen made a big mistake. She didn't know Jake at all. Sure, he was nice. Sure, he was quiet. But that didn't mean he'd give up. Oh no. Jake had a trick up his sleeve, something smart, something sneaky, something Karen would never see coming. He didn't say a word to her right then. He just turned around and walked back to his house, his brain already working hard. What do you think his trick was? Any guesses? Hang on tight, because I'll tell you soon. Inside his house, Jake sat down at his little table. He could still hear the banging and Karen's loud voice outside. Every sound made him madder, but he kept his cool. He tapped his fingers on the table and thought, she can't just take my yard. That's not fair. He knew Karen was wrong, but he also knew yelling wouldn't fix it. He had to be smarter than her. He had to show her she couldn't push him around. Outside, Karen was acting like she owned the whole world. She strutted around Jake's yard, pointing at the fence and smiling big. The workers kept digging and nailing, and that fence kept growing. It was so tall it blocked the sun from Jake's flowers. It was so wide it took up half his grass. Karen didn't care. She thought she'd gotten away with it. She thought Jake was too scared or too weak to fight back. But Jake wasn't scared. He wasn't weak. He was thinking. While Karen bossed the workers around, Jake was coming up with a plan. He remembered something important, something he'd kept in a box under his bed. It was a bunch of papers he got when he bought his house. Papers with maps and rules that said exactly where his land started and stopped. Karen could measure all she wanted, but those papers, they were the real deal. And Jake was pretty sure they'd prove her wrong. He didn't tell Karen that yet, though. He didn't run outside and wave the papers in her face. Nope. He stayed quiet and sneaky, just like a fox waiting for the right moment. Karen kept building her fence, laughing like she'd tricked everyone. She didn't know Jake was watching her every move. She didn't know he was getting ready to turn this whole thing around. So, what do you think, friends? Was Karen really going to get away with this? Or was Jake's plan going to stop her? I bet you're curious. Keep watching, because this story's about to get even better. Jake's trick is coming, and when it hits, Karen's sassy smirk is going to disappear fast. What would you do if you were Jake? Would you yell at Karen? Would you try to pull the fence down? Or would you wait and be smart like him? Tell me in the comments. I can't wait to hear your ideas. The tension was building in Pinewood. Karen thought she was winning, but Jake wasn't done. That fence might be up now, but it wasn't going to stay. Jake's brain was buzzing with ideas, and Karen's big mistake was thinking he'd just give up. Stick around, because the next part is going to be wild. Hey, friends. Let's get back to Jake and Karen's wild story in Pinewood. Things are heating up now, so grab a snack and listen close. Days went by after Karen put up that big, ugly fence in Jake's backyard. It sat there like a mean monster, blocking his flowers from the sun and taking up half his grass. Karen didn't care one bit. She strutted around like she was the queen of the town, her head held high and a big grin on her face. She'd walk past Jake's house every day, swinging her arms, acting like she'd won a giant prize. Look at my new space, she'd brag to the neighbors. Isn't it great? The neighbors didn't know what to say. Some nodded just to be nice, but others whispered to each other, that's Jake's yard, isn't it? Nobody wanted to argue with Karen, though. She was loud and pushy, and most people just let her talk. But Jake? He didn't say a word. He didn't argue. He didn't yell. He didn't even frown. Nope. Jake just watched her from his window, quiet as a mouse. He'd sip his water, lean back in his chair, and keep his eyes on her. Karen thought he was giving up. She thought she'd beaten him. Oh boy, was she wrong. While Karen was busy bragging, Jake was busy thinking. He didn't like that fence one bit, but he wasn't going to cry about it. He was going to fix it. One night, after the sun went down, Jake went to his bedroom. He pulled a dusty old box out from under his bed. Inside were a bunch of papers, boring stuff he got when he bought his house. There were maps with lines and numbers, and some fancy papers called deeds. Jake didn't usually look at them. They were confusing and full of big words. But this time, he sat on his floor with a flashlight and started reading. Guess what he found? Proof. Real, solid proof that the land was his. The maps showed exactly where his yard started and stopped, and that fence? It was way past the line, right smack in the middle of Jake's property. Karen had said she measured it herself, but now Jake knew the truth. Her measuring was a big, fat lie. She didn't own that land. She'd made it all up to trick him. Jake's eyes got big, and a little smile crept onto his face. He held those papers tight and whispered to himself, "Gotcha, Karen." But here's the cool part, Jake didn't run outside right then. He didn't march over to Karen's house, waving the papers and shouting, "Look what I found." Nope. He put the papers back in the box, slid it under his bed, and went to sleep. Why? Because Jake was smart. He wasn't going to rush. He was going to wait for the perfect moment. He had a plan, a really good one, and he wasn't going to mess it up by moving too fast. The next morning, Karen was outside again. She waved at Jake as he walked to his mailbox. "Morning, Jake," she called, her voice all cheery. "Nice day, huh? Love my new yard." She laughed and pointed at the fence, acting like she'd beaten him fair and square. Jake just smiled back. "Morning, Karen," he said, nice and calm. He didn't let her see he was mad. He didn't let her know he'd found the truth. To her, he looked like the same old Jake, quiet, friendly, and too nice to fight back. But inside, Jake was buzzing. He knew something Karen didn't. Every time she bragged about her yard, he'd nod and think, "Keep talking, Karen. Just keep talking." She had no clue he was watching her every move, waiting for the right time to strike. It was like a game, a secret game, and Jake was winning. He'd walk past the fence every day, looking at it with a little grin. That ugly thing wasn't going to stay there much longer. He could feel it. Days turned into weeks, and Karen got louder. She started inviting neighbors over to see her new space. She'd stand by the fence, hands on her hips, saying stuff like, "I've always wanted more room, and now I've got it." The neighbors smiled awkwardly, but Jake could tell some of them didn't believe her. One lady, Mrs. Thompson, even asked, "Are you sure this is yours, Karen?" Karen just laughed and said, "Of course it is. I measured it." Jake heard that from his porch and shook his head. "Oh, Karen," he thought. "You're digging yourself a hole." Jake kept his secret safe. He didn't tell anyone about the papers, not his friends, not the neighbors, not even his dog, Buddy. He'd pat Buddy's head and say, "We've got this, boy. Just wait." Every time Karen waved or bragged, Jake waved back like nothing was wrong. It was hard to stay quiet sometimes. That fence made him mad every time he saw it. But he knew getting mad wouldn't help. Being smart would. And Jake was really smart. One day, Karen went too far. She decided to paint the fence bright yellow, like the ugliest yellow you can imagine. She stood there with a paintbrush, splashing it all over Jake's yard, humming a happy tune. Jake watched from his window, his jaw tight. That was his land she was painting. But he still didn't yell. He took a deep breath and said to himself, "Not yet. Soon, but not yet." His plan was growing bigger and better every day, and he wasn't going to ruin it by losing his cool. Karen thought she had it all figured out. She thought Jake was too shy or too scared to stop her. She'd look at him with that sassy smirk and think, "Poor little Jake. He can't do a thing." But she didn't know what was coming. She didn't know about the papers. She didn't know about the plan. Every time she bragged, she was making it worse for herself. And Jake? He was counting on that. So, what do you think Jake did next? Can you guess? Was he going to use those papers? Was he going to tell someone? Or was he going to do something even sneakier? I'll give you a hint, his plan was so good, it knocked that smirk right off Karen's face. Stick around, friends, because we're about to find out. What would you do if you were Jake? Would you wait like him, or would you tell Karen off right away? Drop your ideas in the comments. I love hearing what you think. The story's getting wild now. Karen's acting like she owns everything, but Jake's got a trick ready. That fence might be standing tall today, but it's not going to last. Jake's small discoveries, those maps and deeds, are about to change everything. Keep watching, because the big moment is coming soon. Hey, friends. We're at the best part of Jake and Karen's story now, the big moment you've been waiting for. Things are about to get super exciting in Pinewood, so sit tight and let's dive in. A week passed since Karen started acting like she owned Jake's backyard. That ugly yellow fence was still there, standing tall and blocking his flowers. Karen wasn't just happy about it, she was proud. She decided to throw a big barbecue right there in her new yard, on Jake's land. She invited half the neighborhood, acting like she was the queen of the whole town. Picture this, it was a sunny Saturday afternoon. Karen had tables set up next to the fence, covered with red checkered cloths. There were burgers sizzling on a grill, bowls of chips, and cans of soda everywhere. Music played loud, and Karen danced around, laughing and waving at everyone. "Come on over," she shouted to the neighbors. "Look at my awesome new space." People showed up with smiles, carrying plates, and saying, "Wow, Karen, this is nice." She grinned big, her hair bouncing as she flipped a burger. She thought she'd won. She thought Jake couldn't stop her. Oh boy, was she in for a surprise. While Karen was busy showing off, Jake was watching from his house. He stood by his window, peeking through the curtains. He saw the smoke from the grill, heard the music, and watched Karen strut around like she owned the place. His backyard, his special spot, was full of her stuff and her friends. It made his stomach twist, but he didn't get mad. Nope. Jake stayed calm, just like always. He had a plan, and this was the perfect time to use it. Jake reached under his bed and pulled out that dusty box again. Inside were those papers, the maps and deeds that proved the land was his. But this time, he had something new, a big white envelope. He held it in his hands and smiled. "Time to move," he said to himself. He slipped on his shoes, tucked the envelope under his arm, and walked outside. The sun was warm, and the smell of burgers floated through the air. Jake didn't rush. He didn't frown. He walked across the street, cool as a cucumber, with a little grin on his face. Karen was in the middle of her party when she saw him coming. She was holding a spatula, flipping a burger, and laughing with Mrs. Thompson. "Oh, look, it's Jake," she said, her voice all sassy. "Come to join the fun." The neighbors turned to look, some waving at Jake. He waved back, nice and friendly. Then he stopped right by the fence right on his land and looked at Karen. "Hey, Karen," he said, his voice steady and calm. "Hope you're enjoying my backyard. But you might want to read this." He held up the big envelope and gave it a little shake. Karen's smile froze. Her eyes got narrow, like she didn't trust him. "What's that?" she asked, putting the spatula down. Jake just kept grinning. "Take a look," he said, and he handed it to her. The neighbors went quiet. The music kept playing, but nobody danced anymore. Everyone watched as Karen snatched the envelope from Jake's hand. Her face was turning red already, like she knew something bad was coming. Karen ripped the envelope open with her fingers. She pulled out a piece of paper and started reading. Her eyes moved fast, and her mouth opened a little. Then it opened a lot. "What?" she yelled. Inside that envelope was a court order, a super important paper from a judge. Jake had been busy that week. He didn't just sit around, he went to a lawyer, showed them his maps and deeds, and told them everything. The lawyer said, "Yup, that's your land, Jake." Then they went to a judge, and the judge wrote this paper. It said, loud and clear, that land belongs to Jake. "Karen, tear that fence down." The neighbors gasped. Mrs. Thompson put her hand over her mouth. Mr. Jenkins dropped his soda can, and it fizzed all over the grass. Karen's jaw dropped so low it almost hit the ground. "This can't be real," she sputtered, shaking the paper like it might change. "No way. I measured it. This is my yard." But Jake just stood there, calm and happy. "It's real, Karen," he said. "Check the maps. That's my land. Always has been." Karen's face went from red to purple. She looked at the paper, then at Jake, then at the fence. She stomped her foot and yelled, "You can't do this. I worked hard for this space. But the neighbors weren't on her side anymore. They started whispering to each other. I knew it was Jake's, one said. She shouldn't have built that fence, said another. Karen heard them, and her eyes got wild. She waved the paper in the air and shouted, "This is a trick. He's lying." But Jake wasn't lying. He pulled out his phone and showed a picture of the map, the one from his papers. "See this line," he said, pointing. "That's where my yard ends. Your fence is way past it." He wasn't mad. He wasn't loud. He was just right. The neighbors crowded around, looking at the phone. "He's got proof," Mr. Jenkins said. "Karen, you're wrong." Karen threw the court order on the ground and crossed her arms. "This isn't over," she snapped. But it was over. The judge's paper was real, and Jake had won. The barbecue went quiet. The burgers stopped sizzling. Nobody wanted to party anymore. They just stared at Karen, then at Jake. He'd been so quiet all this time, and now he'd pulled off the biggest surprise ever. That fence. It wasn't staying. Karen's big win? It was gone. So, what do you think Karen said next? Was she going to keep fighting? Or was she going to give up? Stick with me, because this moment felt so good. Jake didn't yell or cry, he just used his brain and won. The neighbors were shocked, Karen was mad, and that ugly fence was doomed. What would you do if you were Karen right now? Would you say sorry? Would you run away? Tell me in the comments, I can't wait to hear. This was it, the big reveal. Jake's plan worked, and Karen's sassy smirk was wiped away. That court order was like a superhero punch, knocking her sneaky trick right out of the park. The story's not done yet, though. What happens next? Keep watching, friends, because justice is coming, and it's going to be awesome. Hey, friends. We're at the end of Jake and Karen's big adventure in Pinewood, and wow, it's a good one. After that wild barbecue where Jake dropped the court order bomb, things didn't stay quiet for long. The very next day, just one day later, something awesome happened. Workers showed up at Jake's house. But these weren't Karen's workers with their shovels and wood. Nope. These were Jake's crew, ready to fix everything. They pulled up in a big truck, wearing bright orange vests, and they got right to work. Down came that ugly yellow fence plank by plank, nail by nail, while Jake watched from his porch with a big smile. Karen. Oh, she was not happy. She stood at her window across the street, peeking through her curtains. Her face was all scrunched up, and her arms were crossed tight. She was fuming, like, really, really mad. She watched as every piece of that fence hit the ground with a loud thud. The workers didn't stop. They yanked out the posts, tossed the wood into their truck, and cleaned up the mess. By lunchtime, Jake's backyard was back to normal. No more fence, no more yellow paint, just green grass and sunshine. Karen couldn't do a thing about it, and that made it even better. But here's the coolest part, the court didn't just tell Karen to take the fence down. Oh no. They did way more than that. Remember that court order Jake showed her? It wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a big deal. The judge looked at Jake's maps and deeds and said, "Yup, that land is Jake's, 100%. Then the judge told Karen she had to fix everything she messed up. She had to pay for the damage, like the holes in Jake's yard and the flowers she squashed. And guess what else? She had to pay for Jake's lawyer, too. That's called legal fees, and it cost her a lot of money. Turns out, messing with a quiet guy like Jake was the dumbest move she ever made. Jake didn't have to spend a penny. The court made Karen pay for it all. He just sat back and watched justice happen. The workers finished tearing down the fence, and then they drove away, leaving his yard wide open again. Jake walked outside and stood right where the fence used to be. He took a deep breath and looked around. His flowers were free to grow again. His grass could stretch all the way to the edge. His favorite spot was his once more. He smiled big and said to himself, "That's more like it." The neighbors saw it all happen, and boy, did they change their tune. Before this, they thought Jake was just the nice guy, the one who never fights back, the one who's quiet and lets things slide. They'd wave at him and say, "Hi, Jake," but they didn't think he was tough. Not anymore. After he showed that court order and got his land back, they looked at him different. Now they saw him as the dude who stood up and won. "Mrs. Thompson, the sweet lady with the gray hair, stopped by Jake's porch that afternoon. "Good for you, Jake," she said, clapping her hands. "I knew that land was yours." Mr. Jenkins, the old guy with the loud laugh, walked over too. "You showed her, kid," he said, giving Jake a thumbs up. Even the kids who played in the street ran by and shouted, "Way to go, Jake." He wasn't just the nice guy anymore, he was the hero of Pinewood. Everyone talked about how smart he was, how he didn't yell or cry but still beat Karen at her own game. And Karen? Well, she didn't have much to say after that. Usually, she was out in her yard, yelling about something, grass, dogs, whatever. But now, she stayed inside. She kept her mouth shut for once. No more bragging, no more sassy waves, no more my new space nonsense. She'd peek out her window sometimes, but when she saw Jake or the neighbors, she'd duck back behind the curtains real fast. She knew she'd lost, and she didn't want to face anyone. That loud, bossy Karen was quiet now, and it felt so good. Justice was served, hot and fresh, like a pizza straight out of the oven. Karen tried to take something that wasn't hers, and she got caught. Jake didn't just get his yard back, he got respect, too. The neighbors cheered for him, and Karen had to pay for her sneaky trick. It was fair, it was right, and it made everyone in Pinewood smile, well, everyone except Karen. Jake didn't rub it in her face, though. He could have marched over and said, "Ha! I told you so." But that wasn't Jake. He was still the same friendly guy, just with a bigger grin now. He fixed up his yard that week, planted new flowers, mowed the grass, and set up his chair again. One night, he sat outside with his dog, Buddy, watching the stars twinkle. The air was cool, and the yard was peaceful. "We did it, Buddy," he said, scratching the dog's ears. "It's ours again." The whole town learned something that day. Messing with Jake wasn't smart. He might be quiet, but he was strong in his own way. Karen thought she could push him around because he didn't shout or fight. Big mistake. He used his brain, found the truth, and let the court fix it. And when it was all done, he didn't have to say much, the result said it all. So, how satisfying is that, friends? Isn't it awesome when the good guy wins? Jake got his land back, Karen got quiet, and justice came through. What do you think about it? Drop a comment below and tell me, did you like seeing Jake win? How would you feel if you were him? And hey, what about Karen? Do you think she'll try something sneaky again, or is she done for good? I'd love to hear your ideas. This part of the story feels so good because it's fair. Jake didn't give up, and he didn't have to. The truth came out, and the bad guy or bad lady, I guess, lost. That fence is gone, the yard is free, and Pinewood is happy again. It's the perfect ending to a crazy tale. Stick around, because next we'll wrap it up with a fun little lesson you won't forget. How's that sound? Let me know. Hey, friends. We've made it to the end of Jake and Karen's big story in Pinewood. Wow, what a ride, right? That ugly fence is gone, Jake's yard is back, and Karen's not so loud anymore. So let's sit back, take a deep breath, and talk about what this all means. It's not just a fun tale, it's got a big lesson for all of us. Ready? Here we go. So, that's the story of how Jake turned the tables on Karen. He flipped everything around, like when you're playing a game and you surprise everyone with a winning move. Karen thought she was the boss, building that fence and throwing her barbecue like she owned Jake's land. She acted big and tough, waving her spatula and bragging to the neighbors. But Jake? He didn't look tough. He was quiet. He didn't yell or stomp his feet. And that's the cool thing sometimes, the people who seem quiet aren't weak at all. They're just waiting for the right moment to do something smart. Think about Jake for a second. He didn't fight with his fists or his voice. He fought with his brain. He found those papers under his bed, went to a lawyer, and got a judge to say, "Nope, Karen, that's Jake's yard." He stayed calm the whole time, even when Karen was sassy and mean. He didn't let her get to him. He just watched and waited, like a superhero planning a secret attack. And when the time was right, bam, he showed that court order, and Karen's whole plan fell apart. That's what makes him awesome. Quiet doesn't mean weak. Quiet can mean strong in a different way. Now think about Karen. She acted like she owned the world. She marched around, telling everyone what to do, building stuff on Jake's land like it was no big deal. She thought she could push people around because she was loud and bossy. But here's the thing, the ones who act like they're the biggest and the best, they're usually the first to fall. Karen fell hard. Her fence came down, she had to pay money, and the neighbors stopped listening to her. All that bragging didn't help her, it made her look silly when the truth came out. So what can we learn from this? Next time someone tries to push you around, remember Jake. Maybe it's a kid at school who takes your stuff. Maybe it's someone who says mean things to make you feel small. You don't have to shout back. You don't have to cry or run away. You can be like Jake, stay smart, stay calm, and let the truth do the talking. Find your own papers, your own way to show what's right. Maybe it's telling a teacher, or finding proof, or just waiting for the perfect moment to stand up. You don't need to be loud to win. You just need to be clever. This story makes me think about times when I've seen people act big and tough, only to trip over their own feet later. Like, have you ever met someone who brags all the time? They say, I'm the best, or I can do anything. But then something happens, like they lose a game or get caught in a lie, and suddenly they're not so big anymore. Jake's story shows us that real strength isn't about being loud or mean. It's about knowing what's right and sticking to it, even if you have to wait a little. What about you? Have you ever had a Karen in your life, someone who tried to take something from you or boss you around? Maybe they took your spot in line, or said your idea was dumb, or grabbed something that was yours. How did you handle it? Did you yell? Did you walk away? Or did you find a smart way to fix it, like Jake? I bet you've got some cool stories of your own. Drop them in the comments below, I'd love to read them. Tell me what you'd do if you were Jake, too. Would you wait like him, or do something different? And hey, thanks for sticking with me through this whole adventure. You're the best for hanging out and listening to Jake's tale. What did you think of it? Did you like how he beat Karen with his quiet smarts? Did it make you cheer when that fence came down? Let me know in the comments, I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Oh, and if you loved this story, hit that like button so I know. Subscribe, too, because I've got more fun stories coming your way. We'll have new adventures together soon. Before I go, let's think about one more thing. Jake's story isn't just about a fence or a yard, it's about standing up for yourself in a way that feels good. You don't have to be the loudest kid in the room to be strong. You don't have to fight with words or hands. You can be quiet and still win, just by being smart and brave in your own way. So next time you feel pushed around, take a deep breath and think, what would Jake do? Maybe you'll find your own court order, your own way to say, this is mine, and I'm keeping it. Karen thought she could trick Jake because he wasn't loud. Big mistake. He showed her and all of us that the quiet ones can surprise you. The ones who act like they own everything? They don't always get to keep it. Truth wins, friends. It might take a little time, but it wins. So stay cool, stay smart, and don't let the Karens of the world push you down. You've got this. Alright, that's it for now. I'll see you in the next story. Bye for now, friends. Wave at me in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from today. Is it your house? School? Somewhere else? Can't wait to find out. Thanks for being awesome. Let's keep having fun together. Catch you later.